right. Good afternoon. I'm here and pleased to be joined by Dr. Scott Peeples. Dr. Scott Peeples is a professor at College of Charleston in Charleston, South Carolina. And Dr. Peeples, I came across you because I did a Google search because my senior elective called Great Short Fiction was reading Cask of Amontillado. And we're talking about Edgar Allan Poe a little bit, who I've always been very passionate about. I've always loved Poe. I don't know why. I have kind of an attraction to his stories, and also I think the fact that I have occupied a lot of the same cities that he did when he was alive. But I immediately ordered your book, which is called The Man of the Crowd, and I've been making my way through it and learning a lot about Edgar Allan Poe as the person and kind of his whole life. So I appreciate you coming in to talk a little bit about Poe today and your research.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Dr. Peeples, when did you kind of get into Poe? Like, when did you find interest in him, I guess, in your own life?
Well, I've always liked Poe. I can remember when I was a kid hearing his stories even before I think maybe even before I could read at all, and certainly before I was reading him. I remember like older siblings telling me their own versions of stories like the Cask of Amontillado or the Black Cat, just as kind of scary scary bedtime stories. And so I'd always known about him, and then just kind of went through phases throughout my life where I would get into reading more Poe. Then in grad school, I took a course on the modern short story. So kind of like what you were just describing, I became really interested in just the history of the short story, how it developed, and I started to think about Poe differently at that point. Not so much just in terms of somebody who focused on the Gothic, but somebody who really kind of theorized what a short story was supposed to do, and who was really dedicated to the craft of writing short fiction.
Yeah, I talked to my class about what is his essay called? The composition.
The philosophy of composition.
The philosophy of composition, where he talks about a short story is something that should be read in one sitting, and he kind of outlines what is important and what goes into the short story as a piece of writing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it's a fairly simple formula, but it's really been, I don't know, I think it's something that people who write about short stories and people who write short stories still go back to, the one sitting rule. And more, I think more importantly, what goes along with that is the idea that every sentence, every word has to count and has to contribute toward an overall effect. And if you read some short fiction that predates Poe, you can kind of see why people needed to hear that. Sometimes it's kind of loose, episodic, just doesn't have that kind of aesthetic coherence that Poe's best stories do. And so I think that, those two rules, it has to be short enough that the reader is really under the writer's control for the whole time, isn't taking a lot of breaks, and the writer has to make every sentence, every word count toward a single specific effect. That's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think that's really important because I think any great writer today is taught or tries to get rid of unnecessary language, unnecessary words, and Poe is really the first person who names, I guess, the rule of effect that every single word needs to contribute to some feeling within the reader, some purpose in the story.
Yeah, that's right. And he did, he felt the same way about poetry. In fact, the philosophy of composition is primarily about the Raven. But basically it's the same. He has the same rules. I mean, he doesn't like epic poetry, particularly because you don't get that kind of intensity and single effect. So he, by the same token, even though he wrote one novel, he wasn't really that, he didn't have ambitions to be a novelist. He really thought that the short story was where it was happening for him.
So he's known, I guess, a lot today because of his short story writings. But I think and I think I read this in your book, he thought of himself as a poet, um, and popular culture really thinks about Poe in a lot of different ways. Maybe we could talk about just Poe's perception of himself, and I guess our perception of Poe in history as a person.
Hmm. Well, I think it changed a little bit over the course of Poe's life. He early on he saw himself as a poet, published three books of poetry that really nobody bought or read before he was 21. Um, and so that was kind of his originally his vision for himself. But then he discovered that he had to make a living, and he just and figured out that he wasn't going to inherit his foster father's wealth. So while he was living in Baltimore in the early 1830s, he began writing short fiction and sending it off to basically contests, prize contests sponsored by magazines, and saw this as a way to, ultimately make a living. So between writing for magazines and editing magazines, Poe really found his career. So he shifts in the 1830s and begins to identify himself as a magazinist, which is a term we don't really use so much today, but that was his world. And part of the reason that he wrote short fiction was that it was suitable for magazines. And so that was really, that's what Poe did. He edited magazines, he wrote for magazines and sometimes newspapers, but periodical fiction, it needed to be popular. It needed to grab people right away. And he saw that and he thought that was, that's great. That's the wave of the future. And that's what I can do.
Now, is that why he chose such a dark subject matter for a lot of his tales? Is because that was what attracted people's attention and sold to these magazines?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think it's easy, and, not that Poe had an easy life or didn't have some demons, but I think it's easy to overstate that kind of internal uh, internal psychological motivation for his subject matter. I think more than that, he was writing in that genre because he knew that people liked it and that it would get attention. Um, one of the first really kind of gruesome Gothic stories that he wrote, Berenice, he got into a little bit of um, a little bit of an argument with the editor of the Southern Literary Messenger about it, basically taking the position that if you want to sell magazines, you need to publish stuff that people will really be grabbed by, even if it seems to be in bad taste. Um, and to be appreciated, I think he said something like, to appreciate it, you must be read. And this is the kind of thing people want to read.
Now, he was also a critic of other people's work, and that's how he got the nickname, and I just learned about this, the Tomahawk. It doesn't seem like he was very well liked amongst literary circles during the time that he was really writing about other writers.
Yeah, he was he was good at making enemies. He had friends too. I mean, he wasn't just, he wasn't scorned by everybody, but he did get into some verbal scrapes, and he lost a couple of editorial jobs because of just having difficulty in getting along with whoever was his boss. Um, but he wasn't afraid to pick a fight with another writer, and that was also kind of, I think, part of his strategy. Write scathing reviews that are also entertaining and sarcastic, so that people will take notice.
Mm-hmm.
Take notice of you. It's almost kind of like the logic of social media today. In a way, it's if you want to get attention, sometimes you have to be outrageous, or even kind of risk angering other people. Um, and he wasn't afraid to do that. So he would take on established literary figures, And he kind of positioned himself as the truth teller who had the courage to write a negative review of somebody who was widely respected. He would on some occasions accuse other writers of plagiarism, just seemingly just to create a controversy.
He's really the first Twitter troll, you could say.
In a way, yeah.
So you wrote the book, The Man of the Crowd, and I really like the title of this book because I have just read the story, The Man of the Crowd, in which Poe puts a narrator who, I really like the beginning of that story because he's observing, I guess, the city scene, and he's documenting all the different types of people that you would see in a Philadelphia or a New York or a London. And towards the end, he's, I guess, following this person around who is continuously blending in with the crowd. I guess the other piece to this title, and maybe you could explain a little bit more about the title selection, but it's really about how Edgar Allan Poe, when you think about him, you think about a guy who wrote dark tales in a basement, removed from everybody else. But in reality, he was so much at the center of urbanizing America when he lived in, he was born in Boston, lived in London for a little bit, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Richmond, all of these major growing cities. So I'd love to hear you talk about just the title of this work and maybe Poe as the center of the crowd in a lot of these cities as they were growing.
Yeah, I mean, well, as you said, I mean, you just did a great job of sort of pitching my book, because that was the idea, was to counter the notion that I think a lot of people still have of Poe as being isolated from his world, and try to describe him as somebody who was really in the middle of in the middle of his world, in the middle of specifically the cities where he lived. But yeah, The Man of the Crowd, I had a hard time coming up with a title for the book. And I went with that because I felt like that story, it's not exactly obscure, but it's not one of his best known stories. So I could kind of just, play on that a little bit. It's not that I see Poe as the character in that story who is the man of the crowd, but just that in the same way that the narrator of The Man of the Crowd has this fascination with urban life and spends a 24-hour period just walking through the streets of London following this guy. I see Poe as also really much more of an urbanist and much more somebody who was influenced by and fascinated by the cities where he lived than we typically give him credit for.
And I think a lot, again, about Poe is very misunderstood from our perception. And I read your article about the way that Poe is portrayed in movies and television, I guess, especially the recent movie Pale Blue Eye, which you wrote a little bit about. But there's so many different ways that he's characterized today that I think are not true, but I think add to his mystique and the myths around him. Like he was a heavy drinker, that he was lonely in his life, that he was penniless and poor. What are some of the major rumors or myths about Poe that really are not very true?
Well, I mean, some of them are true. I mean, he did have a drinking problem, and it was a major contributor to his, lack of material success and his inability to really achieve some of the things that he wanted to in his career. And he was poor. I think some of the things that people either overemphasize or kind of mythologize about him, he was not a drug addict. I think I'm not quite sure where that came from, but at some point people began to just sort of assume, I think probably because he has characters in some of his stories who use opium, and there was one incident where he took laudanum, which is a tincture of opium, and wrote about it, but it wasn't a habitual thing, and it wasn't, I mean, unlike the drinking, which really was a problem for him, I don't think drug use really played that big a role. But yeah, I mean, another, um, let's see, I think the other thing really is just that Poe was writing kind of out of his own experience when he wrote some of his more macabre stories, and that he must have had a kind of, um, just sort of a tortured soul, maybe a streak of sadism or something, because of characters like the narrator of the Black Cat or the narrator of the Raven. He did write a lot of narratives in first person and really kind of innovated the use of first person unreliable narrators. But I think that's kind of led a lot of readers to think, oh, he's actually writing about himself, which, is generally not the case.
Well, would you say that he is a tortured man? Was he a tortured soul? He had a lot of death in his family, his mother, his stepmother, the woman he fell in love with, his friend's mother, right? Virginia, his bride, who I want to talk about a little bit.
Yeah, I think of it as more somebody who experienced a lot of grief. As you were just mentioning, he lost several people, specifically women, mother figures, including his own biological mother, and really, and really suffered a lot of grief because of that. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to say that Poe had a happy life. He was, I think, also ground down by not extreme poverty, but but sort of poverty line level poverty.
Mm-hmm.
He was getting by, but never really prospering, and I think that was a real source of frustration. And I think he was unhappy to a great extent because he knew how good he was at what he did and felt unappreciated for it. He resented the fact that there were other writers who he didn't regard that highly, but who were celebrated and making a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I think, I think it's safe to say that he was unhappy a lot of the time, probably even clinically depressed toward the end of his life.
Another myth that is popular, I guess, here in Baltimore is that he died downtown in a gutter, like a tragic
Yeah.
death when he was drunk. Is that true? How did he actually die?
Well, it's sort of close to that, but not. But yeah, the gutter thing. I don't think there really is a gutter.
They have a an image or an arrow downtown where it points right to the gutter where he's
Right.
supposed to have died.
Yeah. So I mean, Poe died at in a hospital. The building is still there. I think it's part of the Johns Hopkins Medical Complex. But it was called Washington College Hospital at the time. So he spent his last few days in a hospital bed. He was discovered in pretty bad shape in a tavern. So the part about him being drunk is pretty much true. I mean, he clearly had been drinking over probably a period of several days, and had been just kind of, I think, out in bad weather. He had also recently been sick. So, I mean, he was, I think it was some combination of illness, possibly, and, neurological fever, and maybe some alcohol poisoning. He didn't, but he wasn't literally found in a gutter, and he didn't die in a gutter.
The other thing that, when I'm going over in class the biography of Edgar Allan Poe before we read his stories and his poems is, this comes up, is that he married his cousin Virginia, who was much younger than he was. Can we talk a little bit about that and just kind of how that relationship, because he was in love with her, it sounds like, through reading his correspondences a little bit and some of the descriptions in your book, is that he loved her, but it's hard to picture that being okay, during even this time period.
Yeah, and as I say in the book, I mean, I still can't quite um, figure it out. I mean, it's a strange relationship. Um, the the fact that they were cousins probably wouldn't have bothered people too much at the time, but the age difference was highly unusual. Poe was about 26, she was 13. Um, and um, yeah, I mean that was weird, even in the 1830s.
Hmm.
And Poe's motivation for marrying her at that time is also a little unclear. I mean, I think that mainly he wanted to hold together this family that he had found, or to some extent created, with Virginia and her mother, Maria Clem. And he didn't want to lose them. And he saw the possibility of Virginia being taken in by another cousin, Nelson Poe, and breaking up you know, that three-person family unit. So I don't know if it was. I mean, I think it was more just that he wanted to stay with both her and her mother as a family at that moment. Um, but he loved her. I mean, and I
Yeah,
beyond that, I mean, it is a kind of strange relationship in the sense that when he writes to her, he often calls her Sissy.
hmm
Uh, he
Muddy,
addresses
right?
her
Is
more like a little sister in some ways, or he'll say my sweet little wifey. I mean, it's
Yep.
never kind of what we think of as a mature, grown-up kind of marriage. And that's partly because of the age difference. I mean, Virginia was still only, um, she was probably still only in her mid 20s when she died. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like I said, there's no getting around the strangeness of that relationship.
Well, I find the relationship he had with a friend's mom, just as strange. I think that's described at the beginning of the book. He fell in love with this woman in her 30s, right, when he was 15 or 16.
Yeah. And that too, I mean, I think he saw her as a kind of idealized mother figure. Um, and saying that he fell in love with her, I wouldn't, I'm not sure exactly what that meant for him at that particular moment, but
Hmm.
he was infatuated. I mean, he spent a lot of time with her, and and he was pretty devastated when she passed away. Um,
Yeah, I think in addition, and this is a compliment to the book because I'm finding it really interesting how you're describing the effect of the cities on Poe, but also the effect of different relationships on Poe. I think is just as interesting to me, at least. The mother figures, the relationships he's had with women, but also I think John Allan is a very interesting relationship because for his whole life, he really lacked a father figure, Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, his father wasn't around growing up. He only had John Allan to
mhm.
to really look up to, and it doesn't seem like he had much love for John Allan and vice versa. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated relationship, and I'm glad you brought it up because I think biographers typically look to the loss of his biological mother when he was about 3 years old, and then that being followed by the death of Jane Stannard, who we were just talking about, the death of Frances Allan, his stepmother, his foster mother, sorry, and then Virginia later on, as this series of losses of women. But his relationship with John Allan is really important for the reason that you just stated. He never really knew his real father, and I think he really wanted John Allan's love, in addition to wanting his inheritance. I mean, it's hard to untangle that. There are a lot of letters between Poe and John Allan that still exist, probably more than with any other person, and it can be difficult to tell to what extent Poe is trying to manipulate Allan, um, because once he gets to a certain point, he's always in need of money. And to what extent he's really crying out for his foster father's love. They got along very well when Edgar was a boy. Things started to fall apart when he was a teenager. And they never really got back on track. I mean, they kind of went through cycles of reconciliation and then estrangement. But from about the time Poe was 16 or 17, it's a very rocky relationship. And there are some of the letters that Poe writes to John Allan are just heartbreaking. And I really don't think it's just that that Allan had resources that Poe needed. I think Poe really, I think he really yearned for a better relationship with John Allan.
Yeah, and he went to the University of Virginia for a little bit, and I think I said this in my email to you. I was down at University of Virginia a couple weeks ago and visited Poe's dorm room, which is all set up. It's funny that the Raven is set up everywhere in there, but I guess that makes it seem like, catches people's attention as they walk by. But he needed some money at UVA, and John Allan wouldn't send it to him, partly because he gambled away all the other stipends, I guess, he sent prior. And then Poe goes to West Point, which I always find an interesting move, at least how we picture Poe culturally. This guy who's a poet, and he writes, dark fictional tales about the Raven and the Black Cat, going to a school like West Point, which my sister went to West Point, and I know how serious and cutthroat that place is, and I never really pair Edgar Allan Poe with that institution, but he did pretty well there.
Yeah, if he had, I think if he had stayed, he probably, it's hard to imagine how different his life would have been, but it wasn't that he couldn't hack it. He had already been in the Army for the better part of 2 years. And so, I mean, it's a really interesting part of his life, because he had been in the Army from 1827 to early 1829. He got with John Allan's cooperation, he got a substitute and left the Army. And I think part of how he sold Allan on this plan was to say, what I really want is to go to West Point. And so Allan supported that move, with political connections. Poe was able to get an appointment. And he did well he did well in the Army. He did well at West Point. But I think what happened was, after he had been at West Point for a relatively short period of time, it became clear that John Allan was not going to wasn't going to continue to take care of him financially. And in fact, Allan had remarried and was going to have more children, and Poe was going to, Poe had almost no hope at that point of inheriting any of Allan's money. And I think he just sort of said, well, screw it. His vision of himself as a kind of gentleman soldier who maybe wrote poetry on the side was just shattered. And in fact, Allan, when he went up to New York for his marriage, he wasn't that far from West Point. And he didn't invite Poe. He didn't come to see him. I mean, he made it pretty clear that he didn't really want to have anything to do with Poe anymore. And that's the moment where Poe just throws in the towel, gets himself court-martialed from West Point, and starts over a new life without John Allan. Although he continues to write him to ask him for money from time to time.
Now, I'm perplexed by the relationship between John Allan and Edgar, because as a foster father, I mean, if you adopt a child like Edgar Allan Poe, like, don't you, I guess, what was it about their relationship that caused so much dislike? I mean, it seems like at a certain point, John Allan was just done with Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah, I mean, he never did adopt him. So legally, that was part of the problem. Legally, Poe didn't have any claim on him. from Allan's point of view, he gave Poe a lot. A comfortable home, an education, um, money, social standing that Poe had no birthright to. And Poe, from Allan's perspective, was ungrateful, um, and uh, and rebellious, and kind of threw away the opportunities that Allan offered to him. So it's a real, again, those letters that Poe writes to him are, they're sort of painful because it's this mixture of anger towards Allan from Poe's perspective, not supporting him enough, not loving him, and just a sort of, regret and yearning. And Poe sometimes admitting that he made a lot of mistakes. And it's really, it's a real soap opera. But I think from Allan's perspective, he pulled Poe, he gave Poe a great opportunity in life, and Poe sort of threw it away and resented him for it and didn't, and was completely ungrateful. From Poe's perspective, Allan had an obligation to him, and he never really fulfilled it, that he didn't give him enough money to really support himself when he was at UVA, and that he never really loved him. And so it just kind of went from there.
It does seem, though, that Edgar Allan Poe had such a passion for the art of literature and poetry that although he wanted money and he wanted this inheritance, he was so stubborn to his craft that he wasn't willing to, say, I'm going to do something else to provide for myself. I want to stick with this and write.
Yeah, that's pretty much true. He did, in the early 1830s, he was hoping to get some kind of, government job. It wasn't completely out of the question that he would do something else. But for the most part, he did dedicate himself to the literary world, to writing and editing. I think he always hoped that this would become sufficiently remunerative. I think he always imagined, particularly, that he could run his own magazine, and that could be a way for him to become really more prominent in the literary world, and also to make some money. So that's another part of Poe's biography that often gets overlooked, is he has this career-long dream of founding his own literary magazine, and it never works out.
Well, I'm right at the part where he's trying to start the Pen when he's in Philadelphia, and it seems like that is going to be promising, but that doesn't work out.
Right. I don't want to spoil it for you, but but it doesn't happen.
So I'm curious about just your thoughts on Poe's depiction in media. So the new movie that came out is with Christian Bale. I was all excited to watch it because it's Edgar Allan Poe staged at West Point, a couple murder mysteries. And to be honest, I couldn't really get into it too much. What are your thoughts on the movie and kind of just the way Poe's portrayed? And is there any movie that really captures him as a person?
Well, The Pale Blue Eye, I thought Henry Melling was really good as Poe, and I liked the way that Poe is depicted in the film. And I liked the book, the novel that it's based on too. I didn't think the movie really worked ultimately, but I don't think it was because of the way that Poe is portrayed in it. I don't know, it's been a while since I've read the book, but I feel like there were some subtleties in the book and some things that just didn't make it into the movie, and so the plot seemed more contrived on film than it did in the novel. But what I liked about the way that Henry Melling played Poe is that he's not this kind of tortured artist, because at that point in his life, that really wasn't who he was. He was an earnest, kind of nerdy, uh, would-be soldier who was a little bit older than the other cadets. And that's pretty much how they play him. I mean, a really smart guy who is a little bit out of place at West Point, but is trying to make it. So I thought that was good. I don't think Poe has ever really been portrayed accurately on film, and honestly, I'm not even sure what that would look like. I mean, Poe is still kind of an enigma in a lot of ways, um, but I still kind of feel like they're not doing, they're not doing him justice anytime somebody tries to put Poe on film.
Mm.
And it's an interesting history. Several years ago, there was a film called The Raven with John Cusack playing Poe as, well, he was Poe, but he was cast into the role of detective trying to solve a serial killer series of crimes. And yeah, I mean, John Cusack did fine, but it was just it made Poe out to be kind of this hard-boiled kind of detective figure that just, it was entertaining, but it wasn't really, I think, a serious attempt to represent Poe. And there's never really been, I mean, there have been a couple of older biopics about Poe, but there's really in recent years, no one has really made a serious effort to do that. And of course, then there's all of the movies that are somewhat based on Poe stories, just dozens of them over, from the dawn of cinema, really on up to the present.
I do show the Cask of Amontillado movie that is on YouTube, and even though it's very pixelated on the YouTube version, I just love the way that that's portrayed. So what are your favorite stories, poems of Poe to teach? I mean, I teach Cask of Amontillado, Telltale Heart. I have my students read The Raven because a lot of them, I don't know if they really realize that the Baltimore Ravens are connected to this poem. Mm-hmm. So I make sure that is part of my curriculum in Baltimore City. I mean, you have to read The Raven and really understand how that football team came to be. But
yeah,
how about you? What do you like to teach, and what is your favorite poem or story if you have one?
I typically, when I only have like a day or two to spend on Poe in a class, like a big American literature survey, I usually go with either The Black Cat or The Fall of the House of Usher. And Usher might be my favorite Poe story. I think it's probably the most complex, and even though it's very readable and it's got a really strong plot, it's also kind of difficult in some ways that are, I mean, I think it's difficult in good ways, because you can come back and read it again and again, and there's still going to be some things you're not quite sure about. It's just a great story. So if pressed, I would probably go with that. I really like The Man of the Crowd as well, and that's partly because I focused on it to some extent with the book and made it the title of the book. But I like to give students that story to read because it defies what you think is going to happen in a Poe story. And that might be a little disappointing. Nobody gets killed, and it's not really scary. None of the sort of Gothic conventions actually happen. But that's, to me, that's sort of what makes it interesting, is it's just this sustained exploration of the city, and this weird relationship between the narrator and the man that he's following that just remains mysterious. And the whole point is that there's no gotcha at the end. There's no big climax. It just, he just gives up figuring something out. So I mean, that's not a very, probably doesn't sell the story very well, but I really, I'm sort of drawn to that, just the ambiguity of that story.
Do you think that Poe was trying to make a point in that story? I mean, I think I did read a little bit about your thoughts on that, but I feel like there's some point about city life that he's trying to maybe communicate with the fact that the narrator in that story can't locate the man.
Yeah, and I think that's it. I mean, he has spent the first third or so of the story identifying people as they walk past the window of the cafe where he's sitting, and he kind of prides himself on being able to pigeonhole, classify any type of person who walks by. And so here's this enigmatic figure who he has to follow him because he doesn't already know who he is. And it turns out, at least in the way that I read it, that paradoxically he reflects the city itself, or he's because he sticks to the crowd. He is a reflection of the crowd.
Mm-hmm.
He's not any one um, he's not any one type of person in the crowd. He is the crowd.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what the narrator can't quite fathom. And so in the same way that the modern city was indecipherable to a lot of people and seemed disorienting and confusing, that whole sensation seems to be embodied in this one figure,
Mm-hmm.
who can't be alone. I mean, that's the other thing, is the just that motif, that idea of being a person who can't stand to be by himself, but who isn't really interacting with the people that he's around. And so he's just kind of a night crawler. I mean, he's just going through the streets looking for a crowd to be part of, but he's not socializing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just kind of, I mean, that's just a very cool conundrum for me.
Yeah, that's a really cool discussion topic, I think, in my classes, is talking about loneliness and how it's possible to be lonely or, by yourself in a city like New York, right? Where there's a ton of people around you, but you could still feel that you're on your own, right? You don't feel attached to anything. And I think that's that first line of that story, right? It's in French, is something about being alone.
Yeah, the great unhappiness or disease not to be able to be alone. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, Professor, I really appreciate you coming in today to talk about Poe. I love the subject of Edgar Allan Poe. I always have. I'm really enjoying your book. Let me just ask you one more question. Why Charleston? Why South Carolina? What brought you down there?
Well, two things. I grew up here. I was born in Charleston, and I was fortunate enough to get a job here. So that's pretty much it. I mean, it was a very happy coincidence for me. After a couple of years at other positions, after finishing my doctorate, I I landed a job back in my hometown, and that's just worked out very, very well for me. There is a Poe connection to Charleston. You may be aware of. He was stationed at Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island,
Mm-hmm.
which is which is a barrier island just in the Charleston Harbor throughout the year of 1828. So people in Charleston feel this this sort of connection to Poe. Maybe not quite as strong as Baltimore, but there is the kind of a Poe vibe in Charleston.
Are you a Ravens fan?
Yeah. I'll say yes. I mean, considering that you're in Baltimore, yeah, kind of.
Yeah. I think
Yes.
and just one more thing that I've been talking to Cesare a little bit about is Poe's grave and this is another thing, is I have my students for extra credit go down to Poe's grave and take a picture during his birthday time in October, November time when we read Poe. But someone puts, what is it, Cesar? What is it? Hennessy on his grave, right? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah. So that was a tradition that dates back, I think, to the 1940s. I mean, it had been going on for a really long time. And the figure is known as the Poe toaster, who would leave cognac and roses at Poe's grave every year. So for many years, like, nobody tried, people knew about it, and they would kind of watch for this figure, but nobody would interfere. Nobody would try to reveal the person's identity. And then I think it was around it was in 2009, Poe's 200th birthday. There was a note that said something about the torch. I can't remember the wording, but the tradition was discontinued. And I think other people have kind of tried to do it on their own since then. But up until about 2009, it was presumed to be the same person doing it every year. And people would gather to kind of hold a vigil and watch for him, and also to keep other people away so that nobody interfered with it.
Interesting.
There's a novel by Laura Lippman, who's a mystery writer who's from Baltimore, that uses that as a big part of the plot. Yeah, and it's set in Baltimore, and now I'm having trouble remembering the title of the book, but it's got a kind of it's got a cool Poe motif throughout the novel.
Okay, well, we'll have to check that out. But cool. Well, thank you so much, Professor. I appreciate your time today. It was a lot of fun. Learned a lot. I'm excited to finish your book here, and yeah, thanks very much. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Talk soon.
Okay.
See ya.
Bye.